to another episode of Back to Watercolors. I am glad that you are here. I wanted to make a video featuring these two handmade watercolor palettes. First one here is a palette made by ArtByWaiyi, and I will link her Etsy shop down below. And the other palette with the heart-shaped pans is a palette made by MashasWatercolors. I'll also link her Etsy shop down below. I purchased these colors almost 2 years ago, and that was during the time I was very interested in granulation. My color palette skewed more towards violets, blues, and like hints of green, so a lot of the colors are very similar but different. For this Back to Watercolor series, I wanted to explore painting landscapes. I've been very interested in landscape art and watercolor landscape art in particular, and I did purchase some new paintbrushes to try out and see what paintbrushes I found more useful and helpful while painting these landscapes. I found myself gravitating towards my thick, chunky liner brush, and I found it was really helpful to get very thin lines but also get really big washes of color. I did use my mop brush a lot, but I didn't gravitate towards it as much as I did towards my giant, big, chunky liner brush. The first palette that I showed you is the Handmade Watercolor palette by ArtByWaiyi, and in the watercolor palette I have Vintage Red, Purple Dream, Fairy Purple, Shadow Wood, Fairy Green, Fairy Turquoise, Fairy Blue, Moody Purple, Forest Blue, a Violet, and Indigo Purple in a general indigo. So you can see that my palette very much has a lot of purples and blues and has hints of green and one red, the Vintage Red. In the second palette, this palette is Handmade Watercolors by MashasWatercolors. I have Flame, Peach, Weathered Rose, Ultramarine Magenta, Dark Planet, Turquoise Violet, Turquoise Blue, Ocean Wave, Deep Sea, Cobalt Green, and Shadow Green. So again, this palette very much skews towards the purples, blues, and then hints of green. Throughout my watercolor journey, I had to learn to love granulation. Once you understand them and you know what you're looking for and what pigments do granulate, is not so much a surprise, and it's something to look forward to. When I did start loving granulation, I looked into curating a granulating watercolor palette using professional paints, and also I looked towards artisans who made their own handmade watercolors to pick out watercolors that did granulate. I find granulation to be very dynamic for watercolors. I feel like it adds something special to a watercolor painting. I think no matter if you use watercolors that granulate on hot press paper or cold press paper, they still add a level of depth and texture to a watercolor painting that you can't necessarily get with non-granulating watercolors. I believe that granulation can also be a fun way to play with your watercolors, and that's why I have 2 sets of handmade watercolors, because I want to be able to feel free to play with them and also use them in my professional paintings as well. I don't think granulating watercolors need to be solely for botanical work or landscape work, although I do see a lot of artists who use granulating watercolors for their landscape paintings. I don't think that can only be for landscape paintings. I think you can use granulating watercolors in portraits as well. I have tried it myself, and I use them both in my sketchbook and also in my final paintings. Sometimes I use granulation in the hair to give it more interest. Sometimes I use it in the background of my watercolor paintings. I think there's so many ways to incorporate granulating watercolors into your painting practice. And even with these watercolors here, I don't have a set that really screams this is going to be good for landscapes, but I wanted to give it a try. I think I have a palette that's very cohesive, and I used a lot of the same colors that you won't really see in nature, but because the palette is very cohesive, it works. I did use a lot of my fairy blue, my turquoise blue. I used flame to be the sun for my paintings. I used a lot of the greens that I could, but I didn't want to feel like I was forced to have a palette that was full of colors that were muted and more earthy to make a beautiful landscape. I think you can pick any colors that you feel gravitated to and make beautiful art from them. While painting these landscapes, I felt gravitated towards the wet on wet method of painting watercolors. It's a technique that is very fundamental to watercolor and like building your skills as a watercolor artist. I found that paintings, as far as I can tell, that utilize the wet on wet technique for watercolors, their paintings seem very fluid and they can play with the unpredictable nature of water control and their pigments blending ability and granulation. I think the hardest part for me with doing these little watercolor landscapes is the water control and understanding how to control your pigment and your water ratio. I wanted to make sure that my brush was loaded with pigment every time I touched my paintbrush to the paper, and with this type of paper, it's not like 100% cotton paper or anything like that, so it can only hold so much water. And I noticed that sometimes when I was wetting the paper before I put the pigment, the water would bead up, like it wouldn't really sink into the paper, like how with cotton paper your water like sinks into the paper. So that definitely affects the way the water and the pigment moves onto the paper and like what kind of cool interesting shapes I got. And I believe it would affect how the pigment will granulate because of the way the water is sitting on the paper instead of really sinking into the paper fibers. Painting like this is very fun, it's very freeing, and I want to do more paintings, like little landscape paintings like this. I have been looking at a lot of the little landscapes I've made, and I want to make a bigger painting using this technique, but using it on cotton paper or maybe my studio grade paper that has some cotton mixed into it to see if I get any different effects with my granulating watercolors. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you did enjoy this little landscape paint with me and this little back to watercolor episode. I hope to see you again very, very soon. All right, bye bye. Take care.
Through the arbor